The government runs the country. Parliament acts as a check and a scrutiny body on the people who run the country. So although we're elected at the same time as members of the government, our role is to scrutinise very carefully what the government does, to receive statements from ministers about policy, and to debate those policies and to make a final decision as to whether or not those policies are going to become law.
When the House sits, we start with question time, and everybody sort of knows Prime Minister's question time, which happens on a Wednesday. Every single government department, and it's normally about once a month, has to answer questions in the House. It's very much like Prime Minister's questions, where the Secretary of State and all the ministers have to come before the House and they have to answer questions. And that actually has proved to be the best way of holding government to account. There are also written questions, and you can write letters to ministers and they are obliged to respond. You can also have freedom of information requests, where if you don't think that a minister is really giving you the kind of detail that you want, you can have a freedom of information request to find out specific details. So these are very important ways of holding government to account. But actually it is through having parties that are not the government looking at legislation in detail in committees. They're normally in public bill committees or at select committees, looking in detail at the legislation that government is bringing forward and making objections or asking the government to clarify exactly why it is that they want to introduce something and not something else. And then the other thing that people often forget about is the role of the House of Lords, the second chamber. After the House of Commons has looked at a piece of legislation, it then goes to the House of Lords, and the House of Lords has the power to amend legislation as well. And what people often don't realise is that the House of Lords is appointed, it's not elected, but it has appointed a lot of people who are very expert in certain fields, much more expert than most of the people in the House of Commons are. And actually the level of scrutiny of a piece of legislation is very high in the House of Lords. And so they amend legislation and then bring it back to the House of Commons for us to have another look at. And that always gives us another opportunity to have a look at legislation after the experts have really had a look at it. So these are kind of the main ways that Parliament holds the government to account.
Parliament on the whole holds government to account by the party system, by having an opposition in the House of Commons and by objecting to certain aspects of legislation and voting on that legislation. And again, in the House of Commons, as you all know, and indeed will be said by all MPs, they are elected and therefore they have the mandate to represent the wishes to some extent of their constituents. The House of Lords holds the government to account because it has various mechanisms of asking the government to think again, whether that be through amendments to bills, whether it be through committee work, whether it be through direct questions or written questions to the government or debates. And the government always has to defend its policies in any of those different contexts.